In the early months of 1942, the small village lay at the mercy of its German occupiers. The morning sun, once a herald of warmth and hope, now felt like an unspoken sentence to the girls who called this place home. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by the war, each day slipping further into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The Germans had occupied their town months before, and the terror of living under their rule was not just in the fear of invasion but in the small, suffocating details of life. Their childhoods had been stolen, their futures uncertain, as the echoes of violence filled the air. For these girls, the most harrowing part of the day was always the dawn. The soldiers would march into the village at first light, their boots pounding the cobbled streets with an unsettling regularity. The girls, often no older than 15 or 16, would huddle inside their homes, their faces pressed to the cold windows as they anxiously awaited the sight of the soldiers' figures. There was a palpable tension in the air, a heavy sense of impending doom that hung over them like a dark cloud. The occupying forces were brutal, their very presence an imposition of their power, and it was the girls who often bore the brunt of this cruelty. The soldiers didn't care if they were children. Their authority was meant to remind everyone that resistance was futile, that submission was the only option. The girls knew that, with each passing day, they would be subjected to some form of scorn, ridicule, or worse. It had become a part of their reality, one they could not escape, no matter how desperately they wished otherwise. They had learned early on that there was no refuge from the menacing forces that controlled their village. There were no safe places. There were no silences that weren't shattered by the sounds of boots or harsh commands. Even the simplest acts of rebellion, such as speaking out of turn or resisting the soldiers' commands, could lead to cruel punishments. The girls had long abandoned the idea of living in a world free from this oppressive force. Instead, they focused on survival, adapting to the daily rituals of terror that defined their lives. Their minds, once filled with dreams of the future, had been warped by the constant need to keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention. They would dress quickly, make themselves scarce when the soldiers arrived, and do whatever it took to avoid incurring their wrath. Any girl who was too slow or too visible was likely to face the consequences. The soldiers were known for their unprovoked cruelty, whether it was a slap for being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time or more severe forms of mistreatment. It wasn't just the threat of violence that kept them in check, it was the looming possibility of worse, of humiliation, of being publicly scorned in front of their families and neighbors. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the girls began to lose their sense of self. They were no longer seen as individuals, but as mere objects in the eyes of the soldiers, tools for their dominance. Their spirits, once full of youthful hope and ambition, had been replaced with fear. It was not just the physical scars of the war that lingered, but the emotional and psychological toll of constant degradation. They had begun to believe that this was all they were worthy of: suffering, silence, and submission. The days would bleed into each other, indistinguishable from one another, each one just another chapter in an endless saga of despair. Yet amid this overwhelming sense of hopelessness, there remained a sliver of something that the girls could not entirely forget: the small, fragile remnants of a life they once knew. It was a life before the occupation, before the soldiers and the endless patrols. It was a life of freedom, of laughter, of days spent in the sun without fear. It was a life where they had imagined growing up, dreaming of love, of learning, of becoming someone who mattered. But those dreams seemed so far away now, like echoes from a distant past that could never be revived. How could they hope for a future when the present was so bleak, so filled with brutality and despair? For some, there were fleeting moments of rebellion, a glance exchanged between friends, a whispered word of defiance, but these moments were quickly quashed by the ever-present reality of occupation. They knew that any act of open resistance would be met with swift punishment, and so they clung to the small rebellions that existed in their hearts, even if they could not express them outwardly. They learned to retreat into their own minds, to find comfort in memories of a time when things were different. But even these moments of solace were fleeting, replaced again by the oppressive weight of the soldiers' presence. The girls lived for the small comforts, for the brief moments of peace that they could steal when the soldiers were distracted, or when they were safely hidden away from the world outside. It wasn't just the soldiers who represented the enemy, it was the entire machine of war that loomed over them. The war was a shadow that stretched over every corner of their lives, and no matter where they went or what they did, they could not escape its reach. Even when they were alone, they could feel its grip tightening around them, suffocating them slowly. The propaganda posters on the walls, the loudspeakers blaring out German orders, the endless patrols, all of it was a constant reminder that they were trapped, caught in a world that had forgotten them. The outside world felt distant, unreachable. All they had now were the walls of their homes, the faces of their neighbors, and the uncertainty that came with every sunrise. They had been taught to fear the soldiers, to hate them, but deep down, the girls knew there was no escape. Even in their darkest moments, they understood that resistance would not come from them alone. It would require something far more significant, something they did not yet have the strength to imagine. For now, they could only endure, surviving day by day, trying to keep their heads down and their hearts guarded. The war had taken so much from them, and they had little left to give. And yet, in their hearts, there lingered a quiet defiance, an ember that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard the winds of occupation blew. But they could not have known then that the dawn would bring something altogether unexpected, something that would begin to heal the wounds inflicted by the occupying forces. They could not have known that, in a few short days, British women would appear in their village, offering something more valuable than anything the war had left behind, something that would change everything in ways they could not have foreseen. At the time, the girls could hardly have imagined the possibility of such a gift, of a reprieve from the horrors that had defined their lives. But in the quiet desperation of their existence, the smallest gesture of kindness could offer a glimmer of hope that would ignite a transformation in ways that no one could have predicted. For these girls, their world was about to shift, and with it, so too would the course of their lives. The scorn they had feared, the abuse they had endured, was about to be met with something entirely different. And in that moment, everything would change. In a distant British town, tucked away from the ravages of the war that consumed much of Europe, a small but determined group of women was quietly organizing. They were a mixture of mothers, teachers, nurses, and housewives, ordinary women in many ways, but extraordinary in their courage and vision. As the news of the occupation of countless villages, towns, and cities across Europe reached them, their hearts filled with an overwhelming sense of both sorrow and resolve. It wasn't just the military losses or the bombings that weighed on them, it was the stories of the suffering of women and children under Nazi rule that struck them the hardest. They had read the reports, heard the accounts from refugees, and listened to the radio broadcasts that detailed the grim daily lives of those trapped in occupied territories. But it wasn't until they heard of the plight of young girls, living under constant fear and abuse, that something deep within them shifted. These women, ordinary in their outward lives, had been living in extraordinary times. The war had transformed the world, and, like many others, they had come to terms with their own personal sacrifices for the greater good of their country. Their husbands, brothers, and sons were away at war, and they had all been asked to contribute in whatever way they could. But despite the sacrifices they had already made, something gnawed at them. There was a need within them, something far more personal than simply supporting the war effort from the sidelines. They had been called upon to do their duty for the war, yes, but what could they do for the most vulnerable of those suffering under the occupation? How could they reach those who were too far away, those they would never meet face to face, and offer them not just help, but hope? As the war dragged on, the group of women began meeting in secret, quietly gathering supplies, planning how they might send aid to the girls living in occupied territories. They knew the war would not be won by sending weapons or ammunition alone. It would also be won by maintaining the spirit of those who were living through it. They began to gather the most basic of supplies, things that the girls in the occupied territories might no longer have access to, or which could be taken from them without a second thought. Soap, towels, and hygiene products were simple, mundane items in their daily lives. But to these women, they were not just practical items, they were symbols of dignity. In a world that had turned its back on the most vulnerable, a bar of soap or a clean towel could be a quiet rebellion, an act of defiance against the cruelty that had taken root in the hearts of the occupying forces. They realized that these small items were not just about cleanliness, They represented something far more significant, the restoration of the self, a reminder that even in the midst of occupation, there were acts of kindness, of care, that could not be erased by any amount of oppression. As the women began collecting the materials they needed, they also sought to understand what had been taken from these girls. It was not just their homes, their families, or their safety that had been ripped away. It was their sense of worth. The soldiers who occupied their towns saw the girls not as human beings but as objects, disposable and insignificant. But these British women refused to accept that. They could not bear the thought of young girls, innocent and full of potential, being reduced to nothing more than a tool for the occupation's cruelty. It wasn't enough to simply send food or supplies. The women understood that what was needed was something deeper, something that could not be easily crushed by the boot of an occupying force. The British women did not just plan their mission from a distance. They worked with a sense of purpose that only those who had witnessed the horrors of the war firsthand could truly understand. They spoke often of the girls in the occupied territories, imagining their lives, their faces, their suffering. It wasn't just a political mission, it was personal. For these women, the idea of bringing some measure of joy, comfort, and dignity to those who had been deprived of everything was a powerful motivator. They spoke of the children of their own families, how they had been able to keep them safe, how they had been able to give them some sense of normalcy, despite the war raging all around them. They could not imagine a world in which their daughters, their nieces, or the girls they had once taught in school would be subjected to the horrors they had heard about. It became clear to them that their mission had to be about restoring something far more important than hygiene or cleanliness. It had to be about restoring a sense of humanity, of compassion, that could not be extinguished by any foreign force. Over time, their efforts began to take shape. The group's meetings became more frequent, and they expanded their network, working with others who shared their vision. They collected more soap, more towels, more supplies, anything that could be used to help the girls. It wasn't just about the practical items, though. They wanted to give the girls something that would speak directly to them, something that could convey a message of solidarity. They wrote letters, each one filled with words of hope, with expressions of empathy, telling the girls that they were not alone. These letters were not just generic messages. They were personal, written as if the women had known the girls their entire lives. They told the girls that they had not been forgotten, that there were people who cared about them, who had never stopped thinking about their suffering, and who were willing to do whatever they could to help. At first, the women didn't know if their efforts would succeed. The logistics of sending supplies across occupied Europe were fraught with difficulties, and there were many hurdles to overcome. The soldiers patrolling the roads, the networks of informants who worked against them, these were just a few of the obstacles that could easily thwart their mission. Yet despite the challenges, the women pressed forward, driven by a fierce resolve that could not be shaken by the enormity of the task ahead. They knew that the supplies they were sending might not be enough to end the war, or even to end the suffering of all those in the occupied territories. But they also knew that this small act of kindness might, in the smallest of ways, provide a spark of hope to those who had almost lost it entirely. The British women had no illusions about the nature of war. They knew that for all their efforts, there would be no quick victories, no immediate relief for the girls they hoped to help. But they also knew that the war was not only fought on battlefields or in the skies. It was fought in the hearts and minds of the people who lived through it. If they could offer a glimmer of hope, however brief, to those living in the shadow of occupation, then they had done something that transcended the war itself. They were fighting for something far greater than victory. They were fighting for the very soul of humanity. By the time their first shipment was ready, the women had transformed their quiet mission into a movement of compassion that reached beyond their own community. The message they sought to send was clear. No matter the oppression, no matter how dark the days might become, the human spirit could not be easily crushed. The girls, the very ones who had long been forgotten by the world, would soon receive a gift far more valuable than any ration or relief package. The women had prepared a care package, but what they were offering was more than a mere set of supplies. It was a message of resilience, of kindness, and of solidarity that would reverberate through the occupied territories. It was a message that would change everything for those young girls, even if they didn't yet realize it. And so, as the first batch of packages was carefully wrapped and prepared for delivery, the women knew that they were not just sending soap and towels, they were sending something far more important, the hope of a brighter future, one that they believed was still within reach, despite all the darkness that had befallen their world. The morning the British women arrived in the village was unlike any the girls had ever known. The dawn, which had always signaled fear and dread, came that day with an unfamiliar promise. It was still early, the village shrouded in the faint, ethereal light of morning, when the first carriages arrived, their wheels crunching lightly over the cobblestones. The girls, most of them still in bed or cautiously peering through their small, shuttered windows, did not know what to expect. The soldiers had not yet come to mark the start of the day's horrors, and the streets, usually filled with the sound of boots and harsh orders, were strangely quiet. At first, they thought nothing of it, perhaps just a different shift of patrols, or another momentary respite before the inevitable began. But the silence soon gave way to an unexpected sight. Women, not men in military uniforms, stepping out from the carriages. They were dressed simply, in everyday clothes, their movements unhurried but purposeful. The girls, from behind their windows, watched curiously, still unsure of what to make of these strangers. Who were they, and what had brought them to their war-ravaged village? The soldiers never came in such a way, with smiles or soft expressions. These women, though, looked nothing like the officers and soldiers who had filled their days with fear and violence. There was something different about them, a softness in their manner, a kindness in their gestures. And most striking of all was the air of calm they carried, as if they had entered this place not to conquer, but to offer something far more precious. The first few girls, unsure and wary, ventured out of their homes, instinctively drawn by something they could not quite explain. There were no orders, no harsh commands, just a quiet invitation in the way these women moved, in the way they spoke in low tones, their words directed not at the girls as if they were objects of scorn, but at them as people, as individuals worthy of respect. One by one, the women set about their task, offering small packages, towels, soap and hygiene products, simple things, but things that the girls had long since learned to do without. The girls, many of whom had been too afraid to wash themselves properly for months, looked at the items with wide eyes. So, towels? These were luxuries they had not seen in a long time, and the sight of them stirred something within them that had long been buried. What the girls had expected, what they had grown to anticipate with each passing day, was the presence of scorn. They had been taught, in the most painful ways, to be ashamed of themselves, of their very existence under occupation. They had been told in countless ways that they were nothing more than pawns in a war that they had no hand in starting. Their bodies, their lives, had become mere objects to be used and discarded. But now, this strange group of women was offering them something different. Kindness, respect, and even a small token of care. It was too much for them to process in a single moment. It felt like a dream, a surreal interruption to the suffocating reality of their daily lives. At first, the girls hesitated. They didn't know what to do with this sudden kindness. Was it a trick? A trap? The soldiers often offered the same disarming gestures, gifts of cigarettes or food, but always with an underlying threat of violence. This felt different, but how could they trust it? How could they believe that these women weren't agents of the occupation, here to trick them into doing something that would lead to further punishment? But as they watched the women move through the village, each step measured and gentle, they felt a quiet shift inside themselves, something that had been absent for so long: hope. One girl, perhaps the bravest of them all, took a step forward. She was no older than 16, but her face bore the weight of a life far older than her years. Her eyes, once dull and full of resignation, now sparkled with curiosity. She approached one of the women slowly, almost as if she were testing the air, unsure whether to take the offering or to retreat back into the safety of her home. The woman smiled softly, her face radiant with the warmth of a stranger who was somehow already family. She extended her hand, not with the commanding air of the soldiers, but with the gentle patience of someone who knew that trust could not be demanded, only earned. The girl hesitated, then, with a trembling hand, took the soap. It was a simple bar, but the weight of it in her palm was anything but simple. It felt like a lifeline, a bridge back to something she had long since abandoned, her sense of self-worth. The other girls, witnessing this exchange, began to follow suit. Hesitant at first, then with more confidence, they too took the soap, the towels, and the small tokens of care. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches. It was simply a moment of quiet humanity, one that offered far more than the material gifts in the women's hands. What they offered was a return to dignity. As the morning wore on, the girls began to gather around the women, unsure at first, but growing bolder as the minutes ticked by. They began to speak, haltingly at first, unsure of their own voices, as though they had forgotten how to be heard. But the women listened. They didn't interrupt or dismiss them. They listened, and that in itself was a radical act. For months, no one had listened to these girls. They had been invisible, their voices drowned out by the oppressive force of the occupation. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone was seeing them, not as victims, not as objects, but as human beings. It was not just the soap, nor the towels, nor the hygiene products that began to change everything. It was the simple act of listening, the act of caring for them in a way that had been absent from their lives for so long. For the first time in many months, the girls began to speak, sharing stories of their lives before the war, of the world they had known and lost. They spoke of their families, their hopes, and the dreams that had been shattered when the soldiers had arrived. They spoke of the fear that had become so ingrained in their bones, it was hard to remember a time before it. And as they spoke, they began to realize something important. They were not alone. The women did not judge them, did not pity them. They simply stood with them, sharing in the weight of their stories. And as the words flowed, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a spark in the girls' eyes, a softening in their posture, but over the course of the day, the transformation became undeniable. They were no longer just the frightened, beaten children they had once been. They were not invincible, not free from fear, but they had rediscovered something essential, their sense of dignity, their sense of self. By the time the sun had set on that day, the village had been irrevocably changed. The women from Britain had come to offer soap and smiles, but they had given the girls something far more valuable, the realization that they were still worth something, that they were still human, still deserving of care, compassion, and respect. They had taught them that the war could strip them of their homes, their families, and their safety, but it could not strip them of their worth. As the women prepared to leave, the girls stood a little taller, their hearts a little lighter. They would never forget this day, the day that had begun like any other, with dread and uncertainty, but had ended with something far more precious. They had been seen, heard, and cared for, not by their fellow countrymen or by the men who ruled over them with brutality, but by strangers who had crossed enemy lines, who had risked everything simply to show them that they were not alone. And so, as the women made their way back to their carriages and the village returned to its usual quiet, the girls stood watching them go. They did not know what the future would hold, nor when the soldiers would return, but they now carried with them something far more valuable than they had ever known. The knowledge that there were still people in the world who cared, who would fight to restore their dignity no matter the odds. That, more than anything, was the greatest gift of all. In the days that followed the British women's arrival, the transformation that began to unfold in the village was subtle yet profound. At first, the change was almost imperceptible, as if it were a quiet stirring in the hearts of the girls, an awakening that could not be measured in immediate actions, but in something deeper, something more intrinsic. The girls, who had been so accustomed to fear, to the constant threat of cruelty and humiliation, now found themselves in the strange territory of something they had not experienced in what felt like forever: dignity. It wasn't just the soap or the towels they had received, it was the intangible gift of respect. It was the recognition that they were more than the sum of their suffering, more than just bodies to be controlled or silenced. In the weeks that followed, the village began to shift. At first, it was just the girls who felt this subtle change within themselves, this new, fragile sense of self-worth that began to emerge, like a seed planted in the fertile ground of kindness. They washed themselves with the soap, yes, but it was more than just a matter of hygiene. It was a reclamation of their bodies, of their right to be clean, to be cared for. As they bathed, they allowed themselves to feel something they hadn't allowed for so long, human. They had been living in a state of survival for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in their own skin without fear of defilement. The soap, the simple act of cleaning themselves, became a powerful ritual, one that symbolized the reclaiming of their own bodies, their own worth. The girls began to notice small changes in each other as well. Where once there had been silence, there was now the occasional soft laugh, a whisper shared between two girls who had been strangers just days before. For months, they had only spoken when necessary, exchanging words with the heavy weight of survival in their voices. But now, there was something different in the way they interacted with one another. The girls who had once kept their heads down and avoided each other's gaze now sought each other out. They stood together in small clusters, not with the desperation of those who had nothing left to cling to, but with the quiet confidence of those who had been reminded of their shared humanity. They began to speak more freely, their words no longer heavy with fear, but light with a newfound sense of connection. The simple act of washing with soap had created a bond between them, an unspoken solidarity that went beyond their shared suffering. They no longer saw each other solely as survivors of the same war, but as sisters, bound together by a common experience, an experience that, for the first time, had been met with kindness rather than cruelty. The girls had been given permission, in a sense, to care for each other again, to see each other as more than the victims they had been reduced to. They began to share stories of their families, their lives before the occupation, their hopes for the future. The space between them, which had once been filled with the unspoken weight of fear, was now filled with something far more powerful, a sense of community. They were not alone anymore. The realization was slow to come, but once it took root, it spread like wildfire through the village. Meanwhile, the women who had brought the soap and towels had long since left the village, their mission complete. But their impact lingered, much like the fragrance of the soap that still clung to the girl's skin. The women had come to offer the smallest of gifts, but they had left behind something far greater, the knowledge that kindness could break the cycle of oppression, that even the most modest acts of humanity could leave a lasting imprint on the spirit. The British women, unknowingly, had ignited a spark that would grow and spread far beyond the borders of the village. The girls, emboldened by the kindness they had received, began to see the world in a different light. They no longer felt entirely beholden to the soldiers who had controlled their lives for so long. They began to reclaim their sense of self, piece by fragile piece. The soldiers could take their homes, their families, their freedom, but they could not take away their dignity. That was something they had to give, and now they knew they didn't have to. The village, too, began to shift. The Nazi soldiers, ever vigilant in their control of the occupied town, began to notice something was different. They had been accustomed to the girls cowering in silence, their eyes cast down in submission, their movements restricted by the constant fear that followed them like a shadow. But now they saw something else. The girls were no longer just going through the motions of survival. They were standing a little taller, walking with a subtle but undeniable strength. It wasn't an overt act of defiance, but it was enough to unsettle the occupiers. The soldiers could not quite put their finger on it. These girls, once mere objects of ridicule and oppression, were suddenly becoming something more. Their dignity had been restored, not by force or by rebellion, but by the quiet, powerful acts of kindness that had shown them that they were still worth something. For the soldiers, who had long viewed the villagers with disdain and superiority, this was an uncomfortable sight. They had been taught to view the local population as less than human, as tools to be used in the grand machinery of the Nazi war effort. The girls, in particular, were seen as expendable, their worth measured only by how much labor or suffering they could endure. But this shift in the girls' behavior, their newfound sense of pride, was a threat in its own way. It wasn't something the soldiers could easily control, and that uncertainty began to gnaw at them. They had been trained to instill fear, to crush any sign of resistance before it could bloom. But here, in the small gestures of the girls, this quiet resistance, this restoration of dignity, they saw something they could not easily erase. It wasn't defiance in the usual sense, but something far more insidious. A quiet rebellion, the refusal to remain passive, the refusal to be stripped of their humanity. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in the village became more noticeable. The girls, who had once moved in shadows, now walked with an air of quiet confidence. They began to help one another in ways they hadn't before, offering assistance with chores, helping each other with the practicalities of daily life, but also offering each other emotional support. In small, everyday acts, they began to build a community, a resistance that was not defined by loud protests or acts of violence, but by a profound solidarity that transcended the brutality of the occupation. They had been given something far more powerful than any weapon or political message. They had been given the strength to believe in themselves again. The soap, the towels, the simple gifts from the British women, these had become symbols of something much larger. They were reminders that, even in the darkest of times, humanity could endure. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could plant the seeds of change. The girls were no longer defined by the war, by the soldiers, or by the occupation. They were no longer just victims. They were survivors. They were a community. They were a force in their own right, and as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever the future might hold. And so, the quiet rebellion continued. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was no less powerful. The village, once a place of submission and fear, had become a place of small acts of defiance. The girls had begun to see their worth again. They had rediscovered their voices, and in doing so, they had transformed not just their own lives, but the very fabric of their community. The war, with all its horrors, had not yet ended, but the seeds of hope had been planted. And that, more than anything, was what would carry them through the darkest days yet to come. The soap and smiles had done more than restore their dignity, they had changed everything. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the British women's visit began to manifest in ways both unexpected and profound. The village, which had once been defined by the cold, unyielding presence of its occupiers, now hummed with a quiet energy that was impossible to ignore. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, as if the village itself was waking up from a long, dark sleep. It was not the grand gestures of rebellion or resistance that marked the shift, but rather the smaller, quieter changes, those fleeting moments of defiance that couldn't be easily seen, but could be felt. The girls, once broken by the cruelty they had endured, were now starting to reclaim pieces of themselves that had been lost. They had been given back something far more valuable than their dignity. They had been given the courage to be themselves once again. The soldiers, of course, were blind to these changes. They were trained to see only the surface, to view the villagers, especially the girls, as nothing more than tools to be exploited, controlled, and discarded when no longer useful. But as the days passed, it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the shift in the atmosphere. The girls, once meek and fearful, were beginning to walk with their heads held higher. They moved with a newfound sense of purpose, as if they had remembered something that had been taken from them long ago. The soldiers couldn't quite put their finger on it, but the unease they felt was undeniable. The girls were no longer just cowering in the corners, too terrified to speak, too broken to act. There was something different about the way they carried themselves, something that made the soldiers pause, if only for a moment. It was subtle, this change. There were no public confrontations, no demonstrations in the streets. The soldiers saw nothing overtly rebellious, nothing that would have triggered a swift punishment or reprimand. But in the small, quiet moments, the difference was unmistakable. The girls smiled more. They spoke to one another more freely, and in the warmth of their conversations, there was a kind of unspoken resistance. They had found their voices again, not in a loud, defiant outcry, but in the way they moved, in the way they carried themselves. It was as if they had finally remembered what it meant to be human again. They were not mere victims of war, pawns to be manipulated or crushed under the heel of oppression. They were young women, full of potential, and they were beginning to see the possibility of a future once more. In the wake of this quiet transformation, something unexpected began to happen. The girls, emboldened by the kindness they had received, began to reach out to others in the village. They sought out the elderly women who had been too afraid to speak out, offering their help with tasks that had once seemed too dangerous to attempt. They offered comfort to the younger children, assuring them that there was hope, that there was something beyond the war. And they began to turn to each other, forming bonds of solidarity that had been almost entirely absent in the months of occupation. In a place where fear had once reigned, there was now the gentle emergence of community, of people who had been scattered and silenced coming together in the face of adversity.